Creator Spirit, you gave us this Mother Earth to share. Humble us with the grace to listen with open hearts to country and to the story of others. Unite us all who drink the same water and breathe the same air, and for this we pray. Our ancestors' footprints are imprinted on country. For tens of thousands of years before recorded time, our people have walked on this land, on their own country to which they belong. Our relationship with the land is at the centre of our lives. Our country is our mother. In a sense, our country is us. We listen to country, speak to country, dance and sing up country, care for country, visit country, and long for country. Country is lived on and lived with. We pay our respects to elders past and present and thank them for passing on their knowledge, our language, and spiritual connections to country.
Good evening everyone, and welcome to another episode of Affinity Intercultural Foundation's webinar series. I would like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land. We pay our respects to their elders past and present, and to all descendants who have cared for this place since creation. We also honour all other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us today. My name is David Lowe. I am a member of North Shore Temple Emmanuel. NSTE is a progressive and egalitarian Jewish congregation. One of our core values is Tikkun Olam, our duty to repair the world through our good deeds or mitzvot, and tzedakah, or social action. One of the ways I do this is with the work of the Faith Ecology Network, who are co-hosting this webinar with Affinity. For those of you joining us for the first time, let me briefly introduce to you the Affinity Intercultural Foundation. Affinity was formed by a group of young Muslim Australians in the year 2000. Affinity's aim is to promote multiculturalism and foster interfaith and intercultural dialogue by building bridges between different groups in our society. Tonight's webinar episode is in collaboration with Affinity Intercultural Foundation and the Faith Ecology Network. Like Affinity, FEN is an Australian hub for strengthening dialogue between the scientific and religious communities, which it has done through a range of events and forums since 2003. For too long, we humans have exploited and destroyed our planet's ecosystems. We have become disconnected from the natural world. In 1992, 1,700 scientists warned that human beings and the natural world were on a collision course. Biodiversity loss is now at an emergency level. Religions, religious traditions, and the sciences have something positive to say to each other as we face this reality. Emerging is a new dialogue across diverse traditions. We take the long view. We are collaborating in regenerating a sense of wonder, learning, and the will for faith and all communities to care for the natural world. We can get on board with the United Nations Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, which is being launched today, World Environment Day 2021. And without further ado, I'd now like to introduce tonight's facilitator, Associate Professor Clive Pearson. Clive Pearson is Research Professor at the Centre for Public and Contextual Theology, PACT, at Charles Sturt University, Australia. A prolific writer in the area of public theology, he has written extensively on matters to do with the intersection of climate change, theology, low-lying islands and cities. He was formerly Principal of United Theological College, Sydney, and Head of School for the School of Theology at Charles Sturt University. He is the Editor-in-Chief of the International Journal of Public Theology. Welcome, Clive.
Thank you, David, for your warm introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. I'm speaking to you from the Baramatical People's Land, and I acknowledge their custodianship over time. Today has been World Environment Day, And tonight we will be discussing biodiversity emergency, faiths regenerating wonder and the will to care. And we're very fortunate to have a superb cast for our panel this evening. Our distinguished guest is Professor Lesley Hughes. Lesley is Distinguished Professor of Biology and Pro-Vice Chancellor, Research Integrity and Development at Macquarie University. Her main research area has been the impacts of climate change on species and ecosystems. She is a former lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 4th and 5th Assessment Reports, a former Federal Climate Commissioner, and now a councillor with the Climate Council of Australia. She is also a member of the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists and a director of the World Wildlife Fund Australia. Joining us later in the evening are our respondents, Anne Lanyon and Dr. Susan Murphy. Anne Lanyon is a Sydney-based community educator who facilitates workshops on peace, ecology and justice for students, teachers and community groups. She retired as Deputy Director of the Columban Mission Institute and coordinator of its Centre for Peace, Ecology and Justice late in 2017, when the Institute closed. She is currently the volunteer coordinator of the Faith Ecology Network and the St Anthony's Cairn Creeks Landcare Group in Sydney. She is a member of the Laudato Si New South Wales Network and a local bush carer near her home. Anne is passionate about education for a better world. She is involved in a variety of peace, ecology and justice groups, including being on the board of the Jubilee Australia Research Centre. Her qualifications are a Bachelor of Education from the Australian Catholic University, a Graduate Diploma of Ministry, and a Master of Theology from the Sydney College of Divinity. Dr. Susan Murphy was authorised as a Zen Roshi and lineage holder in both the Diamond Sangha and Pacific Zen Institute in 2001. Murphy Roshi is the founding teacher of Zen Open Circle in Sydney and Kangaroo Valley, and a teacher for both the Melbourne Zen Group and the Mountains and Rivers Zen in Hobart, leading regular 7-day Zen sessions in all three places, and since 2018 conducting fortnightly online teachings in Ekodharma. Her Zen-related book titles are Upside Down Zen, Minding the Earth, Mending the World, Zen and the Art of Planetary Crisis, and Red Thread Zen, Humanly Entangled in Emptiness. She directed the Reel to Real Buddhist Film Festival in Sydney 2004 to 2011, and she has been a frequent freelance producer of feature documentaries for ABC Radio National since 2000. She also teaches part-time in the Master of Arts in Applied Buddhist Studies at Nantian Institute in Wollongong. So we will welcome Lesley as our first speaker, and she will be showing a PowerPoint presentation. And if you have a chance, please make sure you look up her website because it's a superb coverage of many, many issues. Thank you, Lesley.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to deliver this webinar. Happy World Environment Day, but I wish I was the bearer of better news about the world's environment. My focus today will be on Australian biodiversity, and my title is Our Life Support System on Life Support. A few years ago, I read that somebody had described the way in which humans generally treat our biodiversity and environment as being like a thin green slime over the surface of the earth. And I thought that was a pretty good analogy as to how we are treating the earth's resources. We are using the resources at a rapacious rate. We have a day called Earth Overshoot Day, which is an estimation of the day of the year where we have used up all of the resources that we could sustainably use for that year. Back in the 1970s, that year came round about at the end of the year, meaning that we were fully using Earth's resources over 1 year, but not overshooting. But over the last 5 decades, we have overshot that day in a progressive way, such that by about 2019, we were using up all of the Earth's resources by the end of July. That is about 1.6 Earths use by the end of the year. COVID brought that back a little bit in 2020, but of course, as economic activity increases post-COVID, we will expect to see that red line keep going down. We are causing species extinctions at an enormous rate. And you can see from these two graphs that extinctions, which is the dark green line, follows the size of the human population very, very closely. Simply put, the more people we have on Earth, the more species go extinct. This is a very famous graph now from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment from 2003, showing that in the distant past, the fossil record, we can estimate species extinction. If we compare that to around about now, or the recent past, we can see that there is a 1 or 2 order magnitude of species extinctions currently compared to the fossil record. And if we look further forward to the future, it's generally estimated that species extinction rates will increase by at least 10 times the current rate. And I'll come back to the role of climate change in that a bit later in the talk. So how are we going here in Australia? Well, coming back to my Earth overview slide, if the whole world used resources like Australians, Earth Overshoot Day would occur at around about the end of March. That is, Australians are using resources not only unsustainably, but at way over the global average rate. Now, Australia's flora and fauna is a unique mix from all over the place. Some of our species have come from Asia or Papua New Guinea. Some of them are old Gondwanan elements that have been here from Gondwana land for well over 50 million years. And there are many, many species that occur nowhere else because they're endemic to Australia and have evolved here. In fact, Australia has stewardship of somewhere between 7 and 10% of all global biodiversity. We have extremely high levels of endemism in most groups. So, for example, 92% of our plants evolved here and are found nowhere else, 94% of our frogs, 45% of our birds, 93% of our reptiles, 87% of our mammals, and 71% of our freshwater fish. Australia is, from a biodiversity perspective, a very, very special place. But unfortunately, we have not been looking after those species very well. We have a very dubious world record in terms of species extinctions. We've already lost hundreds of species just in the last couple of 100 years since white settlement. We have the highest rate of extinction of mammals of any continent, and we currently have nearly 2,000 species listed under the Federal Threatened Species Act as being at increased risk of extinction. The State of the Environment report, which is produced under legislation every 5 years, so we'll get a new one this year, but the last one, which was in 2016, did not pull any punches in terms of the state of Australia's environment, concluding that our environment in many parts was poor and deteriorating, particularly in the most populated zones, and also highlighted the poor track record of government environmental policy in the long term and the inadequacy of resources devoted to particularly threatened species conservation. Here's just one example from the press last couple of weeks that really goes to the heart of how we treat our environment. In New South Wales, up near Coffs Harbour, there's a road being put in to bypass that city. During the EIS that was conducted as part of that road assessment, 2 new species of plants were found that were unknown to science. They occur there where that little red X on the slide is. If we were serious about our biodiversity, this would have immediately, one would hope, have resulted in a throwing away of the plan to put a road through that area and an alternative plan developed. Instead, the road is going ahead, and all that will be done is that some of those plants, which in some cases are mature trees, will be dug up and planted somewhere else in the hope that they will survive. If they don't survive, that could be 2 whole species that are wiped out by that road. I think this goes to the heart of the attitude of government to threatened species. In 2018, WWF, in their Living Planet report, cited Eastern Australia as one of 11 global deforestation hotspots, the only one in the developed world. A later report in 2020, also by WWF, noted that there was a 68% decline in monitored wildlife populations globally, and that some Australian populations of wildlife had declined 97% just since the previous report. In Queensland alone, it's been estimated that 68 million animals were killed by land clearing in the 2 years between 2013 and 2015. And you can see from this picture why land clearing absolutely destroys species. Land clearing, of course, is not the only threat to our wildlife. Overgrazing across vast amounts of the country, mainly by cows and sheep, is also responsible. Feral species, especially feral cats, kill literally billions of animals every year, millions of animals every single night. And the diversion of our freshwater resources to agriculture and urban uses is also having devastating impacts on our freshwater ecosystems. And then, of course, there's climate change. I'll show you a quick little animation that shows the temperature anomaly, that is the difference between the temperature in any one year and the temperature over the last 100 years on this little graphic. It'll start at 1900. Every country of the world is displayed on this graphic in alphabetical order. You can see Australia up there about halfway through the first line. The blue colours will be the cooler than average years. The red colours will be the warmer than average years. And if you'll excuse the pun, you will see what I mean within a few seconds. It'll take a few seconds to warm up. So that's observed data, and now here's the model data going through to the end of the century. And one thing you can see, apart from the fact that it's getting very hot, is that it doesn't matter where in the world you are, Australia or elsewhere, we're all subject to the same problem. So some of the environmental impacts of this warming are already being seen. Coral reefs are bleaching. In fact, on the Great Barrier Reef, we've had 3 major bleaching events in the last 5 years, and we've lost 50% of the hard coral on the Great Barrier Reef already. Mangroves are also dying. These pictures show mangrove forests in the Gulf of Carpentaria also being subject to a range of threats, including warming oceans. Inland river red gums are being affected by the combination of drought and salinity, as well as that over-allocation of water. And a couple of years ago, the massive fish mortality in the Menindee Lakes in the Murray-Darling as a result of a combination of drought, heat waves, and mismanagement of that water supply. Saltwater is intruding into freshwater ecosystems, especially in the top end, where sea levels are rising at 2 or 3 times the global average. Fires, as we saw couple of summers ago are penetrating into new ecosystems where they have never been before. This is actually a picture of the World Heritage Area in Tasmania, where fires in 2016 killed trees that were over 1,000 years old. Here's some pictures to just show the devastating extent of those fires. Kelp forests have declined possibly up to 90% around the southern coasts of Australia as a result of increases in predation by sea urchins because of warming itself, as well as other human impacts. And over in Western Australia, the Shark World Heritage Area, which was the largest seagrass meadow in the world, has also been subject to devastation from underwater reefs. And even eucalypt forests such as Jarrah Forest in Western Australia, which are pretty tough, showing symptoms of dieback due to the combination of heat waves and drought. And of course, this is how we usually like our wildlife, hale and hearty and very cute. Not how we want to see our wildlife, but these are all pictures taken from the last few years. So the flying foxes in the wheelbarrow there are spectacle flying foxes, where we lost 1/3 of the entire species in a single hot day in Cairns a few years ago. The possums up in the top right hand are common ringtails that were so thirsty during the drought and a heat wave, came down to the beach to drink seawater and died. The cockatoos in that boot are the endangered Carnaby's black cockatoo, also dropped dead in their hundreds in a heat wave. And of course, we lost a devastating number of koalas in the Black Summer bushfires. We've also had the dubious distinction of being the country with the first mammalian extinction confidently attributed to climate change. The bramblequay malomies that lived on this little island in the Torres Strait, the last of them simply drowned during a storm that was amplified by sea level rise. So what do we expect in the future? Well, essentially more of the same, more droughts, more increasing cyclones, more heat waves and more fires. The sorts of fires that we saw in the Black Summer, where 18 million hectares or more was burnt, which incidentally is 3 times the area of Tasmania, will occur again. It's almost certain. In that summer, we lost 80% of the Blue Mountains World Heritage Area was burnt. 50% of Gondwana and East Coast rainforests were burnt. It's been estimated that 3 billion native vertebrates were killed during those fires or displaced, with many threatened species losing most or all of their habitat. For those of you interested in getting a bit more of this rather depressing information, I would direct you to a Climate Council report that I put together with some co-authors a couple of years ago called "This is what climate change looks like." And some of the examples that I've spoken about here are contained in that report. Most recently, I and some colleagues from across Australia have also put together a major review on ecosystem collapse from the tropics to the Antarctic. And we identified 19 ecosystems in Australia, shown there in that little map, where the ecosystem is collapsing at some part of their range. But we also tried to put forward some solutions, because there are solutions. We can't just sit back and wait for the situation to get worse. So also in that paper that I would recommend you read if you're interested in this topic, we put together a framework of solutions, both local and global, that we need to use to address these issues. But it all takes money. Our current spending on threatened species has been estimated to be just over $120 billion per annum, and that's just threatened ones. This is about 10% of what the US spends on their threatened species. And it's been estimated that this is only about 15% or less of what is needed to actually save those species from extinction. I would like to contrast these figures with the amount that the Australian government will spend on each submarine, attack class submarine that is being built, which is $18.75 billion over the lifetime of each of those 12 submarines. We clearly care a lot more about submarines than we do about the unique wildlife of Australia. But we mustn't lose hope, and I want to just quote Wendell Berry, who wrote the manifesto, the Mad Farmer Liberation Front, a wonderful farmer and author, poet and writer. And he said this: "Be joyful, though you have considered all the facts." And at times when I'm feeling depressed about all of this, I think of that quote. Other reasons for hope. Last year, there was a Leaders' Pledge for Nature, where 84 countries around the world from all regions, as well as the EU, committed to reversing biodiversity loss by 2030. This is a really united signal to step up global ambition and encourage others to match that ambition globally. Unfortunately, and perhaps not surprisingly, Australia has not yet signed that pledge, but I do think that we could pressure our government to do so. As Clive mentioned, David, this is the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. It's being launched today. This gives me hope that there will be more resources and more attention, and we stop treating our biodiversity like that thin green slime. Now, with a beautiful picture of the Tasmanian Cradle Lake region where I was just a few weeks ago, and a poem by Haroon Rashid. It's a lockdown poem, and he says, "The world continues its life and it is beautiful. It only puts humans in cages. I think it's sending us a message. You are not necessary. The air, earth, water and sky without you are fine. When you come back, remember that you are my guests, not my masters." And with that, I'll end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lesley, for a very powerful presentation. Before we move to Susan and to Anne, I would like to engage with one or two questions first with you. I must say that I found that the metaphors of the green slime, the overshoot day, then seeing the photographs of the animals on life support and your theme of the life support system being on life support, it makes for quite grim reading. And it leaves me wondering, is there a kind of cascade or threshold moments where maybe we have the fear that it's too late to have the kind of hope that you're speaking about?
Thank you for your question, Clive. I get asked about hope and optimism all the time. Because I work on climate impacts, I do tend to present the gloomier side of the situation. And I've really come to the conclusion that we have to treat hope as a fundamental strategy as much as an emotion. While there is anything left standing on the planet, there is still hope. And if we allow our gloom and pessimism to overwhelm us, you know, a la Wendell Berry, we have to keep hopeful. If we allow ourselves to be overwhelmed and hopeless, then we really are lost. So that while we need to be realistic and honest about the science and what the observations are telling us, I think we have to work very, very hard to save what's left. And I do believe that with sufficient will and sufficient resources and sufficient pressure on governments, there is an enormous amount left to save and to recover.
Just before we go to Anne and Susan, I want to do a follow-up question. I was quite chastened by those reddening circles on the temperature change slide that you showed. And it left me wondering, how helpful are days like the World Environment Day, and now we have the Ecosystem Restoration Decade. Do you find that politicians, mining interests, business interests are actually heeding the sorts of things that you're saying?
Well, look, I don't think the average mining company takes much notice of World Environment Day, frankly. But look, I think any focus, be it from the UN or other powerful organisations, where awareness is raised about what is happening and what we could lose in the future, has got to be a good thing. The worst thing that we can do is give up and ignore things. So if those lobby groups or vested interests are not paying heed, then it is up to all of us to work even harder to make sure they do.
Thank you very much. I also noted, as you were speaking previously, there were a lot of ifs in your explanation about how we need to respond to this change and this challenge. And I'm wondering if you would like to reflect on what Lesley has said. What in particular stood out for you, and whether or not you would like to add something extra into the mix for this evening.
Oh, thank you, Lesley, and thank you, Clive. I guess I respond, as I have been for several years, that Earth is crying out. And Earth is the common that we all have. And that we humans are the Johnny-come-lately in Earth's evolutionary history. So I say that most of us aren't listening to what's really happening because we've become disconnected from nature's systems. At my age and stage of life, and an elder if you like, I've seen with my own eyes the disappearance of species. So around my home here on Gamaragal, Guringai land on the northern beaches of Sydney, 50 years ago there were koalas. I've seen here in my own place the disappearance of, for example, bogong moths. They don't come anymore. Case moths, I don't see them in the trees. Christmas beetles, spotted pardalotes, little silver eyes, golden crowned swamp snakes. So I'm really grateful to you, Lesley, and to your colleagues for getting these findings at least into some media. I think the report was in The Guardian. And I'm grateful too for the recommendations earlier this year of the review into the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. And that recommendation to increase the national standards to protect biodiversity. So the science is out there. So why isn't the response from governments, from the dominant media, from the public, from churches, from mosques, from temples, as urgent as the response to the COVID pandemic? Why is there greenwashing to prioritise destructive land use legislation in the face of your truths? Michael Leunig writes, there are only two feelings, love and fear. Two languages, he says, two activities, two motives, two procedures, two frameworks, two results, love and fear. So I think climate change is a result of the disconnect from nature. But are we really paying attention to what extinction of species means? So the fear about the impacts of climate change will not bring about real change unless we change. So we have to change from thinking about ourselves. So I feel faith communities must and are moving in that direction. The Uniting Church in Australia has been out in front with that. Anglicans, the evangelical churches are all moving in this direction. Lutheran biblical scholar Norman Habel implemented 20 years ago the season of creation based on his reading of scripture with ecological eyes. I'm part of a network of other Catholics across Australia that are going to implement what Pope Francis is teaching in Laudato Si on care for our common home, which he actually wrote for the whole world, not just for the Catholic Church. And so this is what FEN is about. As we, in the different faith traditions and the sciences, listen to each other, learn from each other, Our ears and our eyes are open to a sense of the inherent sacredness of Earth, every tiny bit of life and death. And so we see the sacred in our own reality, we respect it, we protect it, and we love it. So that's kind of a bit of a response to how I feel from your wonderful input, Lesley.
Thank you, Anne. Many theologians have spoken about the need to come to our senses with regards to the way in which we treat creation. And what you have done is opened up the prospect of a Christian spirituality, but also the interfaith, interreligious dimension. So I'll turn to Susan and ask you, Susan, was there something in particular that struck you from Lesley's powerful presentation? And what perhaps might you like to add to the mix of the conversation this evening?
Okay. So thank you, Clive. Thank you, Lesley. And Lesley, your paper, which I did read in great detail, and the presentation you've made today strikes me at a visceral level. And what I think has to happen is that we all have to be struck at a visceral bodily level by the facts. And you talked about love and fear as those two main, Lunig's idea of the two main drivers or bases of our response. What I fear is that the fear level of our culture, our country, our culture, our way of life is mainly quite banal. It's a fear about, will I lose my living standard? Can I afford to change the settings of the way the culture works? I feel as though the faith religions and the scientists, the scientific community both have to begin to dare to call out the economic order for what it is. It's a zero-sum game, and we are the ultimate zero. Not just we in the sense of humans, but non-human beings as well. Life on Earth. It's a zero-sum game with life on Earth. And I feel as though until we feel literally physical pain at the details of those astonishing ecosystems that you, Lesley, have documented in your work, 19 astonishing, they can't be replaced. They can't be made up again. We lose them, we have lost them. And this has to be something that hurts. And it has to be felt so strongly how far we are living by damage. If we are tolerating this, we are living by huge amounts of damage. And I take that phrase from an Aboriginal elder who put it that way. He said, looking around me, I see living by damage. The graphs you showed us, Lesley, make it so clear. The damage we are tolerating, the overshoot we are tolerating. What is it in our faith systems that can tolerate this toleration? How are they not awake to this? How is the emergency of this not rousing a strongly emergent new theology of the earth as sacred, the earth as a prayer, a prayer that we have to share? So this is where I'm coming from with this. It's so painful to see that the major theological traditions that are on the earth at the moment are skewed towards personal salvation. They're not skewed towards the salvation and the honouring of what is often called creation. And there's ways to understand this, but what we also have to understand with this is the fact that it is a huge turnaround that is being obliged towards all of us at every level of our lives. There is such a nature-human split that we have allowed to form all our thinking. And that is in a sense, the fundamental fault that lies at the heart of this, a human-centred theology, a human-centred mind upon the earth. It was actually another Berry, it was Thomas Berry, who said, this is not a collection of objects, this great earth. This is a communion of subjects. He called himself a geologian, marking the fact that his theology had graduated from being a personal theology to a geological theology. And I think that is the reach that is being called for here by every detail you have so painfully put before us. Thank you for the pain. It's valuable.
Thank you, Susan. I am involved in the supervision of a doctoral student from Tuvalu, and I'm aware of all this language of we when we are all in this together, which of course is true. I'm conscious, though, that the way in which these issues affect people around the world is differentiated. Some people are more vulnerable than others. Some are facing more degradation than others. I'm wondering, how does one, in addition to the fear, the love, the hope, how does one insert the idea, the practice of justice and equity across peoples?
I think that the whole attitude of that anthropocentric position that Susan just spoke about is extended to other people as well. So I actually think that Lesley's, we need the wake-up call, as Susan just spoke about, and we need that at this sense of communion and community globally, so that in Australia, where we think we're all right, we need to realise the impact of the loss of species on the actual little ones. And that's where, as a faith tradition, Pope Francis is calling for us to listen to the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth. And I agree with you, Susan, that this need for the new trajectory in eco-theology that you suggested, and it is happening. There are many people sharing these insights from a more eco-centric position and less from a human position.
Add to that a
Yes.
little comment, which is when you were speaking, Lesley, I was reminded of the way that Jacinta Ardern, at the time of the mosque slaughter, not long ago, only a year and a bit, when she spoke, she said, "You are us." And I think that cuts deeper than "we're all in this together," which is a whole aggregate of individual people or countries or hoping to form something called "we all in this together." An ecosystem makes it very plain we're all in this together. There is no opt-out clause. That's just simply the fundamental revelation of any ecosystem. We are all in this together. But deeper than that, at the social justice level, the power to say "you are us" is a very deep demand, a demand that's valuable, I think. It actually asks the private and personal sort of self-interest to fall away and to recognize at a very direct level, my life is also your life. It's not other than your life. And that's true whether it's human beings and non-human beings in conversation, hopeful conversation with each other, but between all human beings as well. So it cuts both ways, or else you could even say it eases both ways, the very injunction that you are us. I think it's a really powerful kind of offer that she made, wider even than the context in which she made it. I was very moved by it. I think a lot of people were.
Lesley, would you like to respond to this question about justice?
Yes. Look, environmental degradation and climate change in particular is absolutely an issue of social justice. We know that globally the people most vulnerable to climate change in particular, but environmental change more generally, are generally those that are poor or otherwise disadvantaged, and it is those people that have contributed least to the problem that are being the most affected. In fact, Sir Nicholas Stern, in his mammoth Stern report, which was very influential in 2006, identified climate change as the greatest market failure of all time. And that's what he meant, was that this was the impacts of climate change will be most felt on those that have had the least to do with it. But look, going forward, I mean, I'm not a theologian, I'm not a person of faith, but I know that there are, people of faith in Australia are a substantial portion of the population. And there is one very, very powerful thing that every one of those people over the age of 18 can do, and that is vote. The problem is that in Australia, which incidentally is the second largest exporter of fossil fuels in the world, so our leadership on this is incredibly important. The problem in Australia is that we do have more than 3/4 of the population that is concerned about climate change, and that goes up every year. However, there is a much smaller portion of that population for which environment and climate are not the number one reason determining their vote at any election. So if indeed climate change and the environment and our life support system was the number one reason why people voted for a particular candidate at any election, then we would see massive change very, very quickly. So I do think that faith communities can be galvanised in that way to put these issues at the absolute top of their list. Because if they come anywhere other than the top of the list, if people are voting about their health or their education or their financial security, all of those things are ultimately affected by the life support system that is deteriorating around us. So I do think faith communities in Australia have both a responsibility and a real possibility of changing things by communicating these issues more widely.
Thank you, Lee. Following on from your comments there, it made me think again about how some of those who are in the most powerful political positions actually lay claim to the Christian faith. And indeed, they need to be challenged with a kind of environmental, ecological rendering of their own faith. I was very conscious of how my student from Tuvalu, who happens to be the co-chair of the Global Indigenous Forum, when he looks out at the world, he just says, "Am I not your neighbour?" He used that at one of the recent COP conferences, and it attracted the attention of Scott Morrison. It also seems to me that the powerful presentation that Lesley has provided us with invites us to extend our concept of justice to include not just other human beings, but the whole of creation, other species, which is something I think that needs to be worked upon. I'm conscious that our time is coming to a close, and I want to thank our presenters, especially Lesley for her presentation, but also for the responses from Anne and from Susan. And at this point, I will hand back over to Ahmet from Affinity.
Thank you, Uncle Clive, and happy World Environment Day. Tonight has been a response to climate and biodiversity emergency demand for a better coordination of environment and nature policies. This event has triggered our concerns about ecological consequences, but more importantly, it has brought an awareness of ecological vulnerability, climate and biodiversity emergency into the world, and worldly conception of justice and national interests. I'd like to sincerely thank Professor Lesley for the very informative presentation and Uncle Clive for generously facilitating tonight. I'd like to extend my thanks to the responders, Anne and Dr. Susan, as well as David for the warm welcoming. Tonight's webinar is a testament to Affinity and our partner institution, FAN, for raising awareness and bringing light to our ecological and climate change in its context, as well as our humanitarian obligations to the environment. I highlight that there are further demands on the faithful action towards climate and biodiversity emergency. For example, high moral and ethical standards, such as looking after your neighbor's rights, looking after environment, looking after ecology are what make a true believer. In addition, religiosity needs to start from the individual. Justice, honesty, and respect for nature are all aspects that need to come from within. It does not help that everybody is looking for justice from other people. I'd like to share with you all the Muslims' culture and the religion of Islam, as there are clear narrations regarding behavior in relation to nature and environment. Protecting the environment and maintaining the eco-balance or biodiversity are among the primary duties of a Muslim. Additionally, the facts and findings of modern ecology and environmental science are understood to be in total accordance with Islamic principles, since behavior towards the environment has been taught by the Prophet himself. Being clean also means not to pollute the environment. Take but give as well. Do not destroy or damage. I think this applies to all, as it is not only a religious duty, but a humanistic duty. This is the essence of the establishment of a green and balanced society in the world. This program, I believe, stimulates public awareness of environmental issues at national and international levels. The core values and beliefs of our aim include the principle that environmental education plays a major role in the attempt to protect the natural environment. Senior Church's spokesperson, Bishop Cliff Huggins, has described the United Nations climate talks as possibly the last chance to save our planet in a strongly worded letter to Prime Minister Scott Morrison. He joined those who are calling on Mr. Morrison to take leadership by announcing more ambitious emissions reduction targets, and to do this well ahead of the summit in November. Politicians and government could have the greatest influence regarding environmental development, given that religious and community leaders may have the important influence on changing attitudes to make a more environment-friendly society. The faith and community leaders and representatives are required to assert the moral dimension, whilst the politicians have the power to institute and pass laws that support it. I hope this awareness will grow importantly in the coming days and will continue with legal regulations, environmental protection for our planet. This crisis can be solved by together in achieving a community goal of improving the human-environment relationship deeply affected by human action and the technological evolution of humanity. With this webinar tonight, we should keep climate action and momentum alive. I would like to end with this statement belonging to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Whoever has a plant in his hand, if he is able, let him plant it into soil, even if it is the doomsday. I hope to host you soon for another Affinity webinar. Have a lovely evening. Thank you.